Hello, welcome back and welcome to video 2 of our short series here. This video we're going to be discussing a Dr. Pamela Davies from the University of Northumbria in the United Kingdom. And her article, which was Me, the use of first person in academic writing and some reflections on subjective analysis of personal experiments and experiences. So, lengthy title. But Dr. Davies, really fascinating woman. She is a sociologist. She's a professor of sociology and a trained sociologist, and that's primarily the discipline she writes in. And so, I think this really again highlights just how cross discipline language and writing is. I mean, all academics have to publish, and when they do, they're going to have to make the choice to do it in the first or third person. Perspective is going to be something they're going to have to keep in mind the entire time, and so it makes sense that they would all be thinking about it. And I've been glad to find that. So, Dr. Davies speaks on how she had a personally traumatic experience, and we'll get into that in just a second, and it's outlined in the article, which I'll link below this video. And she wanted to write about it as both a mother, because it concerned her child, and also as a sociologist. Incident was that Dr. Davies had a young child. I believe it was maybe 8 months old. It was less than a year. And the child rolled off the couch. It was a short couch, carpeted floor. They thought it was fine, her and her husband. Several days later, it became pretty apparent that the child was injured. There was a swelling. And so they took it to the hospital. And the hospital admitted the child and ran tests and took care of the baby. But then also they have 2 other children, Dr. Davies and her husband, and they seized the children. I believe that's the right word. It sounds harsh, but that's kind of how she portrays it. And Child Services launched like a full investigation of the doctor and her husband to see if they were abusing the children and how exactly the injury occurred. An investigator came to their home, and Dr. Davies says it was very traumatic. To be told essentially that you're under suspicion of being a bad mother and abusing your kids, your newborn infant. So very traumatic, and she was having trouble voicing this as both a sociologist, where she was being trained to be dispassionate, disconnected, and as a mother. And she wanted to speak of this, in an academic kind of way, and to really analyze the systems that were in place that led to that suspicion. And that was difficult for her to do without the first person, but she knew she'd be criticized if she used it, or so she says. Back to our project. So last time we met, we were working on planing off this nose. We made our drop cuts here and here. I'm sorry, it looks pretty washed out on my screen. I don't know how it is for you. And you can kind of see the slope of the nose. It's pretty slight. And we're going to be working on this area here. We're going to be molding out kind of the silhouette of the nose. And that's going to require a different kind of cut. We're going to have to make a hard cut in. Right, kind of mushing in there. See, I got the blade going away from my hand all the time. And then you'll get this nice curl of wood. And then you're going to make another horizontal cut down on your drop cut and flick out the wood. And that's eventually going to allow you to dig in there and get that nice drop that becomes necessary to give our guy a real defined nose, which is important for a wood spirit. It's really all about the nose. I don't know if you guys have picked up on that yet, but pretty much if you make the nose, you're done. So I'm going to be carving out our guy's nose, getting ready to start working on his mouth. And while I do that, I'm going to be not cutting off the tips of my fingers and telling you about Dr. Davies' work and her investigation of the use of me in describing this traumatic experience. So Dr. Davies found that she could not separate the emotional experience and, be a scientist at the same time, and what that's often carried, with it being objective and cold, which we discussed in our last video, is not really how science works. She found that using me kind of allowed her to immerse in reflexivity and think about, what happened, reflect, process. And there was definitely, emotions that needed to be put down because they were part of the experience, between citizen and government in this case, and citizen and social services, especially in the field of sociology. The human element and emotions needed to be cataloged, and me was the only way she could do it. So she kind of likes to highlight how this became like a narrative of insight and reflection. And we see this a lot with our students at Clemson, and with writers of all levels, where we're kind of like writing to know how we feel about something. So often it's the case when you're writing a research paper that you'll begin writing, and I think Dr. Davies is kind of discussing this when she's talking about writing to knowing and narratives of insight. You begin writing the research paper or the nonfiction creative writing piece, and you find that by the time you get to the end of it, you are not writing about what you thought you were going to be writing about, because you've come to some realization through your writing that you otherwise would not have been able to come to, and you've learned something through the process of kind of thinking through and putting down the words, and so you have to change your thesis. I very often find, I would say just about every time, I write a paper, I have to go back at the end and say, okay, like, does my thesis does it represent the conclusions we came to? I'm going to pause right now and show you. You guys can see all that good lacing, where I've kind of like pried the wood up, and then I'm going to make a horizontal cut and shear it away. And you can see we're already getting a good brow line. So, wood spirit's coming along. All right. Dr. Davies also forwards something that I really wanted to talk about. It's called standpoint theory. And it talks about the importance of recognizing where you're coming from, right? So Dr. Davies had to reconcile the fact that she was a disturbed mother. But she was also writing from a place of majority and power, right? She was white, middle class, 40-something-year-old academic. So in that instance, she was the majority, and she was writing from kind of like the place of power. But also, she was writing as a minority, right? As someone who was kind of being handled by the government. There's not a lot she could do about it, right? So the powerless element in the equation. So standpoint theory calls us again to see like where are we standing. So I think it bears saying that when you're writing in the first person, especially, but always, no matter the perspective you're writing in, you need to consider what perspective you're coming from, right? Because that's the voice you're going to be lending. Is it going to be one of authority? Are you not an authority? If so, you can kind of work that to your advantage. There are times when using the first person from a place of, not being an expert or not having personal knowledge can lend pathos or relatability to a piece, but you just have to be aware of where you're coming from. And I think Dr. Davies touches on that, and she definitely employs it in her article, which I encourage you guys all to read. It'll be linked below. As she retells this traumatic experience and then breaks it down sociologically. So you really get to see her operate as a mother and then also as a sociologist, and using first person and third person in both exceptionally well. So she's a very talented author, and brings all the weight that personal narrative can bring, and she does it in a way that is scientific. So